Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, How Can Health Systems Participate in Real-World Evidence? My name is Olivia Seifer, and I'm the editor of the Evidence Base, and I'll be your host for today's event. Before I introduce you to our speaker, I'd like to just quickly cover a few housekeeping items. Firstly, all the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around and maximize your slide area to full screen to get the most out of your desktop space. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. A copy of today's slide deck and our feedback survey are located in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. An on-demand version of today's webinar will be available approximately 1 hour after the webinar has finished and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Please do let us know your thoughts on today's webinar by tweeting us at the EviBase or by using the hashtag EVBWebinars, or simply share today's webinar with your friends and colleagues using the Share This widget that's visible on your screen. I'm delighted to introduce you to our presenter for today, Akshay Dhawan. Akshay is currently the Senior Director of Real-World Data at Informa Pharma Intelligence, where he is leading the development of one of the largest global data sets on the market with over 400 million lives of data, with the aim of improving healthcare operations and delivery worldwide. He was formerly at Truveta, a health system-founded clinical data company. Before that, he worked in the data strategy group at Clarify Health Solutions, building one of the largest patient-level data sets in the U.S. across claims, clinical, social, and other types of healthcare data. We invite the audience to submit any questions that you may have for Akshay throughout the webinar using the Q&A widget to the right-hand side of your screen. We will then pose your questions to Akshay in the live Q&A session after the presentation has ended, and then follow up any outstanding questions offline. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Akshay to start today's presentation.
Thank you. I'm excited to present today's event, How Can Health Systems Participate in Real-World Evidence? This is jointly sponsored by Pharma Intelligence, a global information services company offering intelligence solutions to life sciences, CROs, and many other types of entities, as well as Clinarion, which is a real-world data division within Pharma Intelligence. So today we're going to review trends and background in real-world evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about what real-world evidence actually is, how are we defining it. Then we're going to talk about different models that health systems can use to participate in this era of real-world evidence, as well as review a few case studies. So it's important to separate the concepts of real-world data, which is data that describes the patient health status or care delivery, from real-world evidence, which is typically analysis that results from that data. So on the left side, real-world data, there's several types of it, but the most common types are insurance claims, which could be being submitted from hospitals and providers to insurance companies, such as CMS or Aetna or Cigna. And it could be reimbursement information that's submitted back from insurance companies to providers. So that type of information typically has diagnoses, medications, procedures, and in some cases enrollment information, as well as demographic information, usually age and gender. It's typically longitudinal depending on the types of sources that you can get it from, and so it's helpful in a variety of different circumstances when you want to track different diagnoses and procedures that patients have had over the course of their disease or over the course of their lifetime or enrollment within a particular plan. EMRs is another important source, so this is usually the main use case for this, or rather it's routinely collected in care delivery. And so in addition to having a lot of the elements that we talked about, diagnoses, medications, and procedures, it also has data points that describe the health status of a particular patient. So things like lab orders and results, and the clinical notes and free text information will have additional important data points like the severity of a particular disease or biomarkers and mutations that might have been used in a particular treatment or diagnosis decision. So while it tends to be a bit narrower in terms of its scale relative to claims, in terms of number of patients, it tends to be a lot deeper in terms of the richness of clinical information. However, you do need to have relevant tools and technologies to be able to extract and analyze that. And then the two other important types of data: registries, which could be disease or product registries. These are typically set up to collect particular data points that might be really relevant for a disease, such as a patient-reported outcome or a particular severity score. And then devices, which could come in many forms: smart insulin meters, Fitbits, iPhones, variety of devices that are collecting different information about patients that could be used in the analysis of their health status. And then on the right, you have real-world evidence, which, as the FDA defines it, is evidence outside of randomized controlled trials on the benefits and risks of a medical product. So here, your use cases could be comparative effectiveness, where, for example, a life sciences company may be interested in understanding the relevant benefits or risks of different ACE inhibitors, for example, that may have not been studied, combinations which may have not been studied in randomized control trials. So you can typically use this use case to try to get additional complementary evidence on top of randomized control trials, or to provide signals for additional trials to implement. So it could be, for example, a piece of information you use in the design of further clinical trials. In addition, you have synthetic control arms. So, for example, if you had a single arm study in a clinical trial, you may be looking at real world data to provide the natural history of potential cohort that would not, for example, how the disease would have progressed without any intervention. Or if you want to try using the data to find patients who have taken a different therapy and see how their disease progressed, what their outcomes were. Typically here you have to include quite a few methodological constraints and statistical analyses to make sure that you're looking at the data the right way and you're using a similar group of patients. There's a lot of potential for different biases that come in this type of analysis. And then you have your prospective observational studies. So for example, you could be looking at long-term safety many, many years down the line after exposure to a particular therapy. And this is where real-world data is helpful because, for example, you may not have designed a particular clinical trial or might not have the longitudinality in it to be able to measure that, but real-world data can give you many years of that to see different safety events that could pop up. In addition to that, I tend to think of real-world evidence as a broader set of use cases as well. So you could be studying epidemiology of a disease in different patient cohorts or in different geographies. You could be studying the natural history of the disease outside the context of comparing treatments, just looking to understand a disease better and how it progresses, perhaps in different groups of patients. You could be looking to understand which phenotypes could be used in a early rare disease diagnosis. This is often a pain point in terms of patients having rare diseases not being able to be diagnosed early enough. So the data can help you understand what are those initial markers you should be looking at. And then you have biomarker discovery, which could be diagnostic biomarkers or prognostic, looking at, for example, PD-L1 expression level as a biomarker that facilitates treatment selection. So looking at the data can help you understand novel biomarkers that should be studied further, or help you understand the utility of currently used biomarkers as well. So across the world, the use of real-world evidence is increasing. So in the U.S., all the way on the left, the percent of drug approvals with accompanying real-world evidence has been increasing over time. It's up to about 96% in the past year, up from the 70s. And in the EU, in the middle here, the percent of marketing authorization applications has also increased, those that are using real-world data or real-world evidence, up from about 8% in the 2000s to about 40% most recently. And then all the way on the right, across the world in other regions, including Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Africa and Middle East, the number of published oncology real-world evidence studies is also increasing, with a notable boom in the Latin American region. So all this to say that across the world, regulatory bodies, as well as researchers, are increasing the use of data, and a lot of this is happening because data sets are becoming more prevalent. technology is becoming more prevalent, including the use of compute, as well as the ability to store all that data. And so a lot of different people in the ecosystem are driving the use of this. Speaking of which, several different stakeholders are involved here. So regulators are considering real-world evidence more and more as part of their regulatory approvals, as we just saw. They're also providing guidance to the industry. For example, FDA provides several guidance documents over the past couple of years that are guiding the industry on how to think about different data sets, how to use them, how to account for different biases that often come up in analysis. Life sciences and researchers, academic researchers, are creating quite a bit of demand for real-world evidence. Life sciences companies in particular using it as part of their package for regulatory approval, as well as including it in their value dossier for payers, as well as bringing it to providers in the form of medical science liaisons, for example. And providers, hospitals, health systems, HCPs, or providing care, they're generating a lot of the clinical data, the useful data that's being used in this analysis. They're also incorporating real-world evidence into their everyday operations, improving their treatment, understanding how they can select a particular treatment more accurately for a particular patient. Payers on the right side, they're a useful source of claims data, for example, that's being used in the analysis. They're also evaluating real-world evidence for their reimbursement decisions, understanding where to place a particular drug on a formulary, or which particular step edits or prior authorizations to include, how to manage care for a particular procedure. Societies and associations are encouraging innovation. So several different societies around the world are essentially evangelizing the use of real-world evidence, sharing knowledge between different researchers and methods and findings, and overall just being kind of a cross-pollinator in this industry. And then tech companies are obviously playing an important role as well. They're building data platforms, which may be aggregating data sets, or they're building analysis tools, which are helping more and more people analyze the data without necessarily having to have a lot of the intense computational resources to do it. And then there's an important sector within tech as well that's ensuring privacy of patient data using different models and ensuring interoperability of data. So how can health systems and providers get involved in real-world evidence? There are 4 methods that I've shown on the slide here that are very prevalent ways. There are obviously other ones. But all the way on the left, the federated network is a very popular method that's being used at the moment. So essentially this is where a health system or a hospital can participate in a network of other member health systems, and designated third parties can query the data in a privacy-preserving way. So typically a company such as Clinarion here may have nodes or servers placed inside a hospital such that queries can run on those servers, and only aggregated statistics about patient-level health data can leave. So no individual patient-level or PHI leaves the hospital, but rather just aggregated summary statistics about patient cohorts. So this is one method to preserve privacy. It's one of the strongest methods. It also has a large learning health system and collaboration component, in the sense that health systems can reach out to other providers within the network and work together on studies, or study each other's data in some cases, and learn from each other, essentially. And even within a provider or a health system, the researchers and physicians in that health system can use and query the data as well, which kind of results in feedback loops and learnings across the health system. There's also quite a few revenue or funding opportunities through this type of a network. Usually it provides exposure to a large number of life sciences companies or researchers who may be interested in accessing the data to improve their drug development operations or improve their understanding of a particular disease. So by joining one of these networks, immediately a health system can have access to a large demand for data. There's other avenues as well, channel partnerships. So some EMR vendors and other data companies, for example, may participate in a marketplace such as HealthVerity, which may offer access to de-identified data sets for particular use cases, which in some cases the vendors, in most cases rather, the vendors can control the use cases that their data can be accessed for. So this is still privacy preserving in the sense that there's a de-identification step involved. However, now that there's a marketplace in the middle, it's not as strong as, say, the federated network method, where literally no PHI will leave the walls of a hospital. There's also less of a learning health system and collaboration component. It tends to be more focused on the marketplaces making the data available for downstream partners. However, there are revenue opportunities here because there's usually an existing demand channel or commercialization engine that's looking to access that data. And again, none of these are exclusive. A vendor or a data source can participate in multiple of these. You can also build your own platform. This is an avenue that Mayo Clinic has gone down. Some other health systems have gone down this path as well. It's usually time and resource intensive, as you can imagine. There is a learning health system component to this, however, in the sense that providers can really tailor the platform to be used for specific use cases internally by their researchers. You can also go down the strategic venture route, which is essentially a provider forming a joint venture or a spin-out company. Some examples include Mayo, again, with Inference, and then Providence with Advata, the sort of analytics company that they've spun out. So this is a little less privacy preserving than the federated model that we talked about, in the sense that, some data is leaving. Usually it is de-identified, however. There's a good learning health system component to this. Again, a lot of the feedback and analysis from the data can feed back into a network and help improve their treatment and operations. But usually with build your own platform and strategic ventures, you're starting from scratch a little bit in terms of the demand channels, and there's not as many revenue opportunities initially, although there may be over time as you sort of build that channel. But because you're starting and building from scratch, it's going to take kind of a longer time to get there. The other component to think about is that usually in these cases, you're starting with smaller data sets, in the sense that you're not able to aggregate with other data sources like you are in the federated or channel partnerships way. So there may also be a cap on potential revenue opportunities due to the scale of the data set. So a little bit of a deep dive on the federated network angle. So this is one that Clinarion participates in or has built over time across different countries. So essentially what happens is there's some front-end interface that you can access through the browser. A user may enter a particular query, which could be in the form of a patient cohort definition, or trying to understand particular outcomes or events that a particular patient cohort has experienced. So they may enter this into a front-end interface, which then sends the query to a secure private cloud, and that cloud then sends the query to individual nodes in that network. So there could be physical servers that are installed across different hospitals, or there could be virtual machines if those hospitals host their data in the cloud. And the same query is run across all these nodes, and all these nodes essentially have their data in one common data model. So the advantage of this is that you don't need to worry about different systems having different terminologies. Usually the federated network and the vendor who has built that network has typically latched or latch those different data models to one common data model, so you can run the same query on all of the data. And then typically each of those nodes would then return back an aggregated result, which is then aggregated further and then returned all the way back to the left on the front end. So the advantage of this, again, being that no PHI leaves the particular hospitals, so it's compliant with the all the different laws and regulations across the world. And it allows a variety of different analyses to be done in a privacy-preserving way. And as an example of the federated network in action, so here's an example where a pharma company was interested in understanding the epidemiology and characteristics of multiple myeloma patients in Turkey. So this was an area where previously it was difficult to obtain data. It was maybe in literature, but maybe there wasn't enough literature to be able to support their understanding of this region. But this data is useful for them to help prioritize or think about how they should launch a particular drug, what additional studies they should generate in order to satisfy regulatory requirements in that region. So they essentially searched 13 sites from Clinarion in real time by entering in a protocol, and all of the sites returned approximately 1,300 multiple myeloma patients. And here's some examples of the different characteristics and statistics you can generate on those patients, including their basic demographic information all the way to Charlson Comorbidity Index, and then understanding what are the most common treatment regimens. And further analysis would reveal the order of those treatment regimens, which ones are used first, which ones are used second, et cetera. And here's another example, which is a bit more focused on the provider side. So this is a provider who was interested in understanding the long-term safety risks for prostate cancer patients who are taking androgen deprivation therapy. So they found through analysis of EMR data that prostate cancer patients who take ADTs down the line 6-7 years later maybe at a higher risk of developing dementia. So that's what you're seeing in this middle graph here, which is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve showing that in the blue line, those who take ADT are at a higher risk or a higher probability of developing dementia. And for this, the analysis was also replicated on a broader claims data set of greater than 300 million patients. So this is a good example of how different sources of real-world data can be used together to support seeing one trend in one source and seeing it in another source, so providing further evidence towards a particular trend or safety risk happening. So the broader data set revealed a similar finding, and all the way on the right in particular, because of the scale of the data set, allowed the researchers to see that different drug classes may have different risks associated with them. So in particular, some of the more modern drug classes may have a lower risk of developing dementia, whereas some of the older drug classes may have a higher risk. So these are potential findings that may inform, for example, additional randomized controlled trials to be set up to try to confirm and provide further gold standard evidence for this issue. And it could be used, for example, by pharma companies to find that this is an unmet need, and perhaps they may need to be doing certain other R&D activities to develop, for example, other drugs, or provide education to their providers to be able to take into account this potential risk. So last two case studies have shown some different angles, one looking at a federated network and how a life sciences company benefited from it, and the second looking at academic researchers and how they were able to use real-world data to further enhance their understanding of the disease and potential safety risks of a particular product. So as we've seen, the benefits to health systems vary. In the short term, it's making data available for research, which can benefit internal treatment and operations and understanding of the disease. And externally, it can benefit the community in being able to learn about a particular disease or treatment or intervention. By participating in federated networks, for example, health systems can analyze patient cohorts and outcomes quite easily through that network's infrastructure and front-end interfaces. They can also access a global network of data in certain cases. With Clinarion, some of our member hospitals across the world are working together to understand variations in care and disease across countries. And health systems can fund additional research and development by participating in additional clinical trials, for example, which may come through the form of the network, or additional real-world evidence projects, which may bring revenue shares or funding that health systems can use for other efforts in their organization. In the long term, this leads to better patient care, more research and publications, expanded awareness of diseases, for example. The revenue stream can support better patient care and better operations within a hospital. And overall, the concept of a smart hospital, the health system being able to use its data to better its treatment and operations, this vision is more attainable by participating in real-world evidence through one of these channels that we highlighted, be it a federated network or a channel partnership or a build-your-own platform or a strategic venture. Hopefully, what you've seen here helps illustrate that health systems and providers have a very valuable data asset that they can make available for research purposes to help improve healthcare treatment and operations around the world. And hopefully you'll find a way internally and externally to be able to participate in this new era of real-world evidence. So with that, I'll turn it over for any questions.
Thank you so much, Akshay, for that really insightful presentation. I'm sure our audience found it of great interest and value. If you, the audience, do have any questions for Akshay, then please continue to submit them using the Q&A tool in the right-hand side of your screen. We've received a number of questions so far, so we will address some of them now live on air. The first question that I'd like to pose to Akshay is, how do you comply with privacy regulations such as GDPR or HIPAA?
Yeah, thank you. So obviously with the different models, there's different ways to comply with the regulations. With the federated model, it's pretty clear. What you do is you place, in the case of Clinarion, these physical or virtual machines, so physical servers or virtual machines inside of hospitals so that no patient level data actually leaves the hospital environment, and only those with authorizations in the hospital can actually see the PHI. In addition, in those physical servers, you can have a de-identification engine to further de-identify the data, so you take out key PHI that isn't really necessary in any sort of analysis. So patient name, address, that sort of stuff. And then you can retain some things that are required in analysis, such as date of service for a particular procedure, but then make it so that that individual at the patient level, that information can't be released, but rather in aggregate for a patient cohort, that information is released. So that's one of the primary methods. Another method is through expert de-identification, which is common under HIPAA. So certain vendors in the U.S. may be de-identifying their data and making it available through research. And typically in that process, they're de-identifying in a similar manner that I just described. So you're taking out PHI that isn't really necessary in the U.S., for example, social security number, that sort of information, but you're retaining some of the key elements that are necessary for analysis, and then you're having an expert or someone who is kind of versed in statistics and bioinformatics take a look at the data set and make a certification essentially that the risk of re-identification of patients is minimal. So that federated model and the de-identification model, they're two common models that are in use to comply with the regulations.
Great, thank you for that answer. Another question that we've had through is, what expertise is needed in hospitals to be able to work with data? Yeah, another good question. So obviously there's a great deal of expertise needed on the data side. If you're going the route of building your own platform or trying to do a lot of the data aggregating
and analysis yourself. So on the data side in particular, you'll need an IT team that's storing the data, a data engineering team that's architecting how it's stored, where it's stored, the data model that it's stored in, and then sort of taking the raw data and putting it into an analysis-ready format. And then you have a team of potentially data scientists and data analysts that are accessing and analyzing the data. And that's only if you as a hospital or a health system are analyzing it yourself. Usually at that point, you could go down the route of a federated network, such as Clinarion, which can help with a lot of that data engineering and access and analysis capabilities. Or if you go down the channel partnership route through a HealthVerity, for example, you can make it so that the data is just licensable and you don't have to worry about the downstream analysis. But those are some of the data capabilities. Obviously, there's a whole set of bioinformatics and those with more clinical knowledge who can help. In particular, if you're extracting data points out of unstructured clinical text or doctor's notes, they can help identify which particular data points are of more importance. They can help validate models. That's a really critical piece of expertise as well. If you're going down the route of commercializing the data yourself, you'll also be having some of the more business side of things. So those who are sort of reaching out to end users, such as life sciences companies or academic researchers, so that marketing capability, that sales capability, some of those traditional business capabilities will be required as well. And they may not be in the core competence or core set of capabilities for a hospital. So that's where kind of accessing one of these models that we discussed today can help you get access to those capabilities and also an existing demand channel of customers who are ready to kind of consume the data.
Thank you. A third question that we've had through is, how can a hospital with lower patient volumes participate in real-world evidence?
Yeah, so it's all relative. If your data set is kind of in that range of 1 million patients or more, there's a lot that you can do with it. Obviously, it also depends on the disease, so the epidemiology of the disease that you're trying to study. So more chronic diseases, heart failure, diabetes, hypertension, those sorts of things can be studied on most data sets, depending also on what service areas your hospital or health system is in. The rarer diseases may be a bit more difficult. So if you're looking at like hemophilia, for example, or beta thalassemia, it may be a bit more difficult, or some of the rare inherited retinal diseases may be difficult if you don't have sufficient patient volume or if you're not specialized in that particular service area. But typically, a hospital with a particular data set will have some value to some segment of the market. Now, that value grows if you join a federated network, for example, which may have other data points. So overall, your data set now joins a broader data set, which as a whole can benefit multiple studies. That's one kind of angle. The other angle is if you join a marketplace or you de-identify your data along with other data sets in a partnership and bring them together. Now you're building greater data sets of greater scale that can enable many different types of studies. So overall, lower patient volumes isn't a barrier. There's multiple ways to get around this particular issue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all those questions, Akshay. Before we wrap up for today, I was just wondering if you had any last comments you'd like to add.
No, thank you everyone for your time. Hopefully you found the presentation insightful, and if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to reach out to myself. You can find my contact details, I believe, through this platform, or you can find me on LinkedIn. You could also reach out to us either at Sightline Pharma Intelligence or Clinarion, and we're happy to answer additional questions or work with you on your real-world evidence needs. And I hope that together what we've learned today can help us together improve healthcare and make data more available for research so that we can together advance healthcare in the human condition. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I'd just like to once again thank you for being such a wonderful presenter today, and thank also our audience as also for all their time and questions. If you'd like to let us know your thoughts on today's webinar, then please feel free to complete our feedback survey in the resources widget or tweet us at the EviBase. Don't forget to visit the evidence base as well for more webinars and more real-world evidence information. Thank you again so much, everyone, for attending, and goodbye.